Sonoma Land Trust is a local nonprofit organization that protects land in Sonoma County for everyone's benefit. We've been doing this work since 1976 and have protected over 60,000 acres in Sonoma County. We accomplished this work through the generosity of friends like you and our members and contributors. So thanks to all of you who are out there helping us to protect beautiful Sonoma County for future generations. Sonoma Land Trust has played a vital role in preserving many of the parks and open spaces along the Sonoma coast. And this is a very important region of focus for our conservation and stewardship efforts. Our focus is on creating a resilient and connected landscape that supports ecosystem health and wildlife permeability and habitat needs, as well as the scenic values and recreational opportunities for residents and visitors alike. The conservation lands that Sonoma Land Trust has preserved include the Red Hill addition to the Sonoma Coast State Park, the protection of key parcels along the Estero Americano tidal estuary, and the Little Black Mountain, Pole Mountain, and Jenner Headlands preserves, which altogether comprise a 6,300-acre protected landscape. Some say it is the Point Reyes of Sonoma County. We are engaged with a multitude of funders, community groups, science-based nonprofits, and tribal partners in the proactive care and stewardship of these priority conservation lands for the goals of climate resilience and broader community benefit. As we pursue our mission of conserving and stewarding the lands of Sonoma County, we recognize that we stand upon the unceded lands of many Indigenous peoples. We honor their knowledge, their care, their stewardship of these special places across the ages, and acknowledge the deep and lasting impact and damage that colonization has inflicted on them. We embrace our responsibility to learn from and protect their cultural and traditional connections to the land. So this evening, I have the great honor of introducing Dr. Laura Rogers-Bennett of the UC Davis Bodega Marine Laboratory, who will provide an in-depth overview of the sudden and devastating kelp forest ecosystem collapse in Northern California. She will inform us about a few of the innovative approaches to research, monitoring, and restoration, and encourage us as a community to engage with and learn more about kelp deforestation in Sonoma County and around the world. Dr. Rogers-Bennett completed her PhD in ecology at UC Davis and 2 postdoctoral fellowships at UC Santa Cruz's Institute of Marine Science and U Washington's Friday Harbor Labs. Dr. Rogers-Bennett is a research associate with Karen C. Dreyer Wildlife Health Center at University of California, Davis, and a senior environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife in the Marine Region. She is based at the UC Davis Bodega Marine Lab, where she leads a team of investigating marine ecosystem health and invertebrate populations, fishery management, and marine conservation, and has over 70 scientific publications and 12 book chapters on marine issues. She is also a co-principal investigator working on the restoration of the critically endangered white abalone in California and has established a 20-year underwater marine ecosystem monitoring program to document the impacts of climate change and the massive marine heat wave event of 2014 to 2015 on the kelp forests and abalone resources in Northern California. Welcome, Dr. Laura Rogers-Bennett, and thank you.
Thank you. Tonight, I would like to talk with you about multiple stressors that have come to Sonoma County, Mendocino County, Northern California, and tipped our lush kelp forests into sea urchin barrens, this perfect storm of negative impacts to our kelp forests. But first, I would like to thank you, Shanti Edwards, Ingrid Stearns, and Neil Ramos at the Sonoma Land Trust. And most of all, I'd like to thank all of you listening in on Zoom to hear about these important issues. Northern California is home to beautiful, lush kelp forests, but they have gone into a tipping point and have shifted into an alternative state, which is sea urchin barrens. So today I'd like to talk with you about what kelp are, what algae are, how cool they are. I'd like to talk about kelp forests and the ecosystem services they provide, talk about sea urchins, ocean warming, and then at the end I'll talk a little bit about highlight some of the work that's going on right now to combat some of this kelp forest decline. So all of us like to breathe oxygen. I like to breathe, you like to breathe. And a lot of that is coming from algae in the ocean. Many of the things that we think of as giant kelps are very new. And this is a new species, the golden V kelp, that was discovered in Alaska in the Aleutians just in 2008. So this is a kelp that grows to be more than 6 feet long. So it's not a very small, innocuous thing. So we are still learning about kelps, and we're still learning about the oceans. Kelps give us all kinds of important ecosystem services. We harvest kelp for algae. We have ecotourism and kayak guides, important fisheries, cultural value, and blue carbon. Carbon is sequestered in kelps that break off and then sink into the deep ocean. And they're an important source of carbon sequestration. We know from some of Karen Philby-Dexter's work that our region has a lot of seaweed-derived carbon in the deep water. So you can see the US here in orange. We're an important source and region for kelp-derived carbon being lost down into the deep water for carbon sequestration. We know that kelps do more than just that. They are also what we call ecosystem engineers, or quite literally, they are the underwater forests. They provide food and shelter, just like our redwood forests do for a whole suite of organisms. They provide kelp subsidies for deep water communities where the kelp floats down and off into deep water, and they structure our subtidal communities. Here is a typical photo on the left before our kelp forest declined, where the seagulls are standing on the bull kelp forest. Kelp is also shedding particulate carbon, and that particulate carbon is food for larvae of many invertebrates. Here we see an example of some very new work in 2018, where these researchers up in Friday Harbor, University of Washington, discovered that algae water and the particulate carbon can feed larvae of sea urchins. We know that kelp floats down into the deep. This is at 45 meters, and those are urchins clustered around kelp that has sunk down into the deeper water. Kelp is also the structuring component of many of our underwater forests. And we have different kelp species here in California. Some of you may be familiar with the giant kelp, which is more abundant in Monterey and Southern California, where the fronds come off of the stipe all the way up to the surface. In Northern California, we're at the southern end of the bull kelp range, and bull kelp has a large floating ball at the top, and the blades come off, and all the blades are mostly at the surface of the water in the kelp canopy. So we have these two different kelp species. They're both some of the fastest growing organisms. They grow more fast than corn, which we think of as a very fast growing organism on land. Kelps can grow 2 feet per day. We also have some important differences between our Northern California bull kelp forests and the giant kelps, and that is our bull kelps are annuals, much like some of your garden vegetables are annuals. They have to come back every year after they are ripped out during the winter storms. that usually start in our region in October or November. So kelp structures are underwater habitats. On the left, you see a pterogophora and other kinds of algae. In the subtitle on the right, you see an urchin barren, which is dominated mostly by purple urchins in this photo. So in our region and other parts of the world, there is an increase in kelp deforestation. And this has had negative impacts on all of the organisms that live in the kelp forest, things that we fish for and that we use. And it has also had negative impacts on the urchins themselves, as well as species diversity in the kelp forest. We are not the only region with these kelp deforestation problems. Ocean warming came to Western Australia, and in the northern part of Australia, which is the warmer water, that warm water came down and destroyed a lot of their kelp forest, and it impacted abalone fisheries and other fisheries in the region. You can see that during the marine heat wave in 2011, there was widespread kelp deforestation along the western coast of Australia. And it went from a very kelp-rich kelp forest area, which is photo A, to photo B, which was dominated by urchin and not much else. We can see that this had large impacts on their abalone and sea urchin fisheries. And this is just an image of the regions that were closed to abalone and urchin fishing following the marine heat wave. So we have these two states that the ecosystem can be in a species-rich kelp forest, or it can switch into a less productive, less diverse community, which in this case is dominated by sea urchins. And this doesn't happen in a gradual way over time. In this case, it's a rapid shift, kind of like falling off of a cliff. It's a tipping point or a threshold. And once you cross that threshold, the whole ecosystem shifts. So this is what we call nonlinear dynamics, leading to abrupt shifts between these two alternative stable states. How did we get here? So we've drafted a paper in 2019 talking about these combined impacts of multiple threats that came into our region. We had sea star wasting disease, which negatively impacted a lot of our sea stars, in particular the sunflower sea stars, which are now locally extinct. And I'll talk more about that. We had a warm water episode, which was started by the warm water that was associated with a massive marine heat wave that reached from our region all the way up into the Gulf of Alaska, had negative impacts on the important fisheries up in the Gulf of Alaska. This marine heat wave, which occurred in 2014, was followed by a 2015 and a 2016 warm water blob. So this warm water lasted in our region for multiple years, and with it came a purple sea urchin population boom. All these things combined were negative impacts for our kelp forests. And what you could see was this persistent warm water and sea urchin populations shifted this part of, this is a photo of Salt Point, looking from the south, looking north in 2012, and the exact same point I photographed in 2016. These are photos from Cynthia Catton And what we can see is that there's really no kelp canopy where it used to be very thick bull kelp forest. So we've seen this series of stressors, and that's led to kelp forest decline, primarily in the Northern California region where we have bull kelp forest. The reason why we know many of these impacts very well is because we had a long time series before 2014 where we were able to track abundances of kelps, sea stars, sea urchins, and abalone at these 10 sites in Sonoma and Mendocino County. These two counties, before the marine heat wave, made up the heart of the kelp forest. 95% of our bull kelp forests were in these two counties. We can spread out tapes underwater and have divers swim along and count and measure the organisms. Many groups are doing this, working to track the kelp forest underwater. And you can see a diver here recording the different purple sea urchin on the rocks there. And what we found during these surveys is that sea stars began to experience a disease where they began to melt, their body began to disintegrate, and they began to die. This is a sunflower sea star, the Pycnopodia, and this species was hit very hard during the sea star wasting disease, and it has not recovered in our region. Sunflower sea stars are now functionally extinct here in California, in Southern Oregon, and in Northern Baja California. We do see a few. We've seen 7 since 2014 on our transects in Sonoma and Mendocino County. A lot of the sea stars were impacted by this disease. Pisaster also decreased in abundance, but has slowly been coming back, whereas Pycnopodia, the sunflower stars, have not. Sunflower stars are very important predators of sea urchin. This is a photo from Alaska where they're still quite abundant. They're eating attacking 2 red sea urchins in this case. But these are very large sea stars. Some of them are 1 meter across, and they are very important predators in our system. Of course, Northern California, many years ago, had sea otters. We haven't had sea otters in this area for a long time. They are more common down in Central California, and they are also voracious sea urchin predators. And there's been a lot of new work thinking about the energetic value of the sea urchins and the behaviors of the sea urchins, and how sea otters are impacting that in that region. Monterey is now experiencing large increases in purple sea urchins, just as we have seen in our region. And there are now areas, almost half of the reef check sites are purple urchin dominated areas. Sea otters are also present down at San Nicolas Island. They've been slowly increasing their numbers in the past 10, 20 years. And purple urchin are becoming a larger component of their diet. You can see the purple in these bars in the most recent years, 2020 to 2023, is getting larger portion of their diet. All these large scale purple sea urchin populations are having now reported at almost 60 times what we've seen in the past in Northern California. and that's having huge impacts on the rest of the ecosystem, including the abalone. This is a photo from British Columbia where they've had sea urchin barrens for decades. These urchin are able to withstand low food conditions. They can degrow or shrink, and they can resorb dissolved organics from the water. They can utilize bacteria and diatom films. So they are very good at handling starvation conditions. In our region, as I mentioned, the bull kelp has a 1-year lifespan. It's an annual species, so it has to regrow every year. And these very small young life history stages, the small sporophytes, are very vulnerable to overgrazing. And when we have high densities of purple urchin, the sporophytes, before they reach the surface, can be overgrazed very quickly. So how many urchin do we have? These are numbers from 2023 at many of our sites. And you can see that our urchin numbers in the past were very low up until about 2013, 2014. And then during this area that's light pink, which is the marine heat wave and the subsequent El Nino events and the warming, really the purple urchins took off, and they're still at very high densities at many of our sites. So we had persistent warm ocean conditions. Our oceans have been getting warmer. And we know that that is bad for kelps. How do we know? Because there is nutrient limitation for kelp above 12C. And in those years, we had many days in a row above 12C. You can imagine if you are growing 2 feet a day, that you really need a lot of nutrients in order to grow that quickly. And so those warm water events, here's a image of many of the extreme marine heat waves that have taken place in our oceans. You can see the example I gave on the Western Australia coast, which was in 2011. We had a massive marine heat wave here in the Pacific, which impacted Sonoma and Mendocino County, as well as up into the Gulf of Alaska. And there have been other marine heat waves, but this is a very new phenomenon to us, and we are still learning about it and still creating definitions for what a marine heat wave is. So you can see for our region, now I'm focusing in on the west coast of North America. You can see that this was a very strong warm water event. This dark red is warm water that came up close to our shores, and the oceanographers called it the warm blob, which I love. The technical term was the warm blob. Warm blobs were warmer than 12 degrees C, and this is work by Marisol Garcia Reyes, and she found that the amount of nitrogen in the nutrients were very low when you got warmer than 12C, and this has huge impacts for our kelp forests growth. These are some flyover data from aerial surveys, and if I can orient you to how these are aligned, I've got the years going down the columns, and across is the row giving each of these sites. So 2 up in Mendocino, 2 in Sonoma County. And you can see that the land is tan, and in the water is green kelp coverage. This is when the kelp grows all the way to the surface towards the end of the summer, and the airplane can fly very low and make a snapshot of this kelp coverage. And you can see that in these more recent years that we have less than 5% of what we had back in some of the earlier years before the marine heat wave. We can also use satellite imagery to image some of the kelp canopy cover, and that has a much longer time series, which is very nice to use, and we've used that in recent times. So without all this important kelp, what we're seeing is starvation conditions. The urchin are able to withstand some of these starvation conditions, but abalone and other mollusks are not. So here are some abalone that are looking for food. They've got the foot up in the front searching for food. And there's very little fronds for them to eat. We worked to see in 2016 and 2017 how the abalone were doing, and we were able to check the health of about 6,000 abalone that were taken in the fishery. We worked with the recreational abalone divers to examine their catch before they took them home, and we were able to find that many of these animals were shrunken and starting to metabolize their own foot muscle, and they looked like little hockey pucks inside the shell, which is the stage just before death. So they're weakened, and many of the large swells dislodged the abalone in those early years, 2016, 2017. Many of those abalone have moved very, very shallow. They're sometimes in the intertidal band up looking for algae and food. And what we see is that if you're walking along the shore, you may actually see more abalone than you're used to, because they've all been forced up into this very narrow band along the shallow water, where they're more vulnerable to things like dislodgement from waves and also freshwater events from rainstorms. So we are seeing a huge decline in the abalone densities at many of these sites. You saw the urchin figure where all the lines were going up, and this is the abalone figure where all of the lines are going down. So we have mass mortality of abalone as a result. The freshwater flows have been killing some abalone during storm events, and we've gotten reports of mass mortalities because the animals are so shallow. So we're looking also to see whether the reproduction has been impacted by abalone. Reproduction by abalone has been impacted, and we're looking at these small veliger and juvenile stages. We're looking at some experiments that we ran in the laboratory showing that warm water conditions are very bad for abalone reproduction. And we're looking at plankton toes to try and catch larval abalone. And we're seeing that in the most recent years, there's very few larval abalone in the plankton. Our lab has also developed methods for sampling very newly settled abalone. These are abalone that are less than 1 millimeter in size. They are too small for you to see, but we can see them with the microscope when we bring the samples back to the lab. They settle on this wonderful pink coralline algae. which is on the right here. This rock is covered with what looks almost like a pink paint, but it's actually an encrusting algae, and it is a crust, and the crust emits a neurotransmitter which triggers those larval abalone in the plankton to come and settle. So it's a cue for telling the larvae, this is shallow, good habitat for abalone, come settle here. So this neurotransmitter initiates the metamorphosis process. So they go from a swimming larva to a newly settled baby abalone, and they land on this pink crustose coralline crust. Now, the problem with that is that the urchin are starting to eat through this calcified algae as well as some of the fleshy algae. So there's less settling cue for abalone. So this is how we sample for them, and they are very tiny, and we haven't been seeing many in our samples in the most recent years. So they're having a negative impact on the recreational abalone fishery. This was approximately $44 million fishery. It was recreational only, and the Fish and Game Commission closed the fishery in 2018 because of these mass mortalities that we were observing and the lack of abalone food, which is the kelp. This fishery means way more to Northern California than $44 million. It's an important fishery for tribal people, for recreational fishers. I taught my kids how to abalone dive, and now I can't go with my daughter who's actually never been. So this is part of our cultural heritage. It's part of our treasure, our national treasure here in Sonoma County. And we've lost this resource during this kelp forest collapse. The commercial fishery for red sea urchin is a very important fishery in California. This year, it's either the third or fourth fishery in the state. And right now, the landings in Northern California have been very small. So we've had a collapse of the commercial red sea urchin fishery here in Northern California. You might think this is counterintuitive because I've just told you that we have way more urchin than we've ever had. However, there isn't the food available for them to have to be full and to have any kind of food value. So the urchin fishermen can harvest them, and when they crack them open, they're empty and worthless, so they cannot sell the product. So we've had the closure of the red abalone fishery, the recreational fishery here in Northern California, and we've also had a decline in the commercial red sea urchin fishery, and many of those fishermen have had to file for federal disaster relief due to this marine heat wave and this ecosystem crash. So there are lots of things happening and lots of work ongoing that are trying to grapple with this ecosystem disaster. And as I've mentioned before, we're not the only region in the world that has experienced kelp forest collapse. But we are doing lots of different things, and there are so many things happening in this space that I'm just going to highlight a few things that are going on, but this is by no means an exhaustive list of all the things that are going on. One of the things we're looking at is where might we create small pockets of healthy kelp forest so that they will be there for when the ecosystem turns around, and we will have some kelp spores there to aid in kelp restoration naturally. Are these small pockets of kelps? Where should we try and encourage these kelps to stay, because we want to maintain our genetic diversity of kelps here in the southern portion of the range of bull kelp. We also find it much easier to restore organisms when there's still a few left than when there's completely none. So we're calling these kelp oases or recovery sites. Where would be a good spot for them? Maybe in areas that already have kelp, so favorable microclimates. I think many folks in Sonoma and Mendocino County are familiar with microclimates that produce different grape varieties for wines. We have the same kind of thing in the ocean, microclimates that have very different kinds of wave action or depth or topography. So those kinds of things, what are going to be most favorable? Where should we target urchin control measures? Is it possible to harvest some urchin and ranch them and fatten them up, get them so that they're ready for market? So these are all kinds of restoration strategies that people are thinking about and actively involved in. So just as I said, a few things. We've got the Watermen's Alliance and many groups that are associated with dive shops. They've been out and free diving and removing urchin. We've got areas where there is urchin smashing allowed in Casper Cove. We have a commercial urchin fisherman who has developed this underwater vacuum, which has been very good for removing some of the smaller urchin. We've got a lot of local groups that are working in this area and have been making really great strides. Here are just a few of the folks. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There have been some work down in Monterey, removing urchin and smashing urchin. Urchin ranching, the idea is to bring in an empty urchin, feed it a kelp-derived pellet, and then see how it fills up and fattens up and get it ready for market. And some of those early trials, which have been happening at Bodega, Moss Landing, and San Diego State, they have been very successful fattening up empty adult urchin. Thinking about this microclimate idea, where might it be best to, where might our kelp restoration efforts work the best? Thinking about the natural climate that would facilitate kelp growth. Thinking about refugia, where is the remnant 5% of our kelp left, and why is it where it is? Is it because there may be some freshwater runoff from rivers that kill the urchin in that area? Is it because the freshwater discharge is favorable for some of the nutrients for kelp? There's also some active kelp restoration methods, thinking about tying bags with fronds that are spore laden down in the substrate, thinking about seeding these bricks with twine that might have kelp spores on them. in the sunflowers, we decided and we talked about how sunflower sea stars are no longer in California or northern Baja California. They are only in small areas in Washington State, British Columbia, and up into Alaska. They are still alive and at reduced numbers, but still present. We've had some exciting breakthroughs in this area. Dr. Hoden, who works up at the Friday Harbor Lab, has just closed the cycle and gotten sunflower stars from spawning all the way to juveniles. He published his paper in 2021. He's sharing that technology with others. There's going to be a sunflower star lab down in Monterey where they're hoping to grow sunflower stars. So this would be the start of a restoration program for the sunflower star. And as you know, we also have people thinking about marine carbon dioxide removal projects and how kelp deforestation has been impacted by this urchin barren situation. So we need to really think more about carbon dioxide removal and carbon sequestration. So I encourage everyone to read more about what's happening. And I hope that this spurs you on to get more involved. And what I'm hoping is that you will have some good ideas about how to help our kelp forests, how to think about restoration, and how important our undersea forests really are. Thank you very much.